Hello and welcome to the Financial Services Innovation Coalition's video podcast. My name is Brady Buckner, and I'm the president of the Financial Services Innovation Coalition, or FSIC as we call it. Our mission statement is designing policy to help all communities participate in the modern economy through research, programming, and advocacy. Today's topic is anti-competitive behavior and understanding its impact on the average person. Our guest today and again is Mr. Kristian Soltes. He is a senior associate with the law firm Constantine Cannon out of New York office, and he is an antitrust and whistleblower attorney. Chris, welcome back. Can you do a brief introduction and why this topic is so important to you?
Sure. Thanks, Brady, and thanks for having me back. We had fun last time. So last time we spoke a little bit about antitrust generally. Really the 5-minute explain like I'm five takeaway of what it is and why it matters. And today I kind of want to drill in a little bit more about that last part, about why it matters, and specifically why it matters to the most vulnerable of us, why it should matter to the most disadvantaged communities. Because we'll find that, while everyone is harmed, all consumers are harmed by anti-competitive activity. It is, surprise, surprise, the disadvantaged and the most vulnerable of us that end up bearing much of the burden and being disproportionately impacted by it. And it's particularly acute today, and we'll talk about it maybe. Inflation is something that families are really dealing with directly. It's something they feel, and
right.
Nobody really knows where to point the finger. Politicians tell us to point the finger at the other side, but nobody really understands the role that consolidation and anti-competitive activity, the role that has to play in causing the current environment.
Well, as you know, one of the ways that we met is we did a piece on the Work Number and how they had bought up all the competition and they were raising fees. And we believe that goes to the consumer. There's no direct line, but we believe anytime somebody raises the price to a company that's doing those kind of services, that the consumer is going to feel it one way or the other. And that's what we believe. And so, talking about it again today, and we'll have more of these, because these are little things that we want people to take away and go, I didn't think about that. And so that's why you're here today and you're the expert. So let's get right into it. Talk to us about competition and why everybody should care.
Sure. So on the high level, if you know anything about antitrust, or maybe if you tuned into the previous episode that we did, antitrust is really the laws designed to protect competition. It's really the set of tools that government agencies like the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice or practitioners like myself use to protect competition, to protect everyone's fair shot at competing and succeeding. I mean, that's ultimately, when you think about it, the American dream. But without these protections, you have, runaway firms, runaway consolidation, unfair practices like agreements not to compete, or divvying up a market, or ensuring that access to markets only go to a few, or maybe just yourself if you're the monopolist. So without antitrust, what you have is entrenchment. The same dominant firms, the incumbents, controlling the market, controlling the price, controlling the access, controlling the supply, and others cannot break into this market. And so you have further entrenchment, and that is incredibly impactful in ways that we don't know. I mean, often you talk about antitrust and it's almost like you're talking about the back dark corner of the library where no one goes unless you have a research assignment or you're a wonk. But that's not right, because it's incredibly impactful. And maybe we can talk about a couple of examples, real world examples, just to drive this home.
Okay. So speaking of consolidation and entrenchment, practically speaking, what does that mean for disadvantaged communities? Those are the communities we support. Can you give some examples like you were just saying?
Sure. I'll give you the general explanation, the theory, and then I'll kind of drive it home with a few examples. So first and foremost, consolidation in markets can increase price. It's the big red flag. All of a sudden people are paying more, and it doesn't make sense why they should be paying more when the costs to produce these goods or services are not more expensive. So, how are dominant firms able to kind of create these excess profits? And when you see them doing that, it's the big red antitrust flag. It's like, hey, pay attention. Because when you control a market to the exclusion of other competitors, there's no one to discipline your prices, right? So prices go up, and that's bad for all consumers, right? Well,
they're not going to police themselves.
No, they're not going to police themselves
at all.
and that's a very good point, because the only way to discipline such behavior is really the people who are impacted, the communities who are impacted, have to know that it's happening, to be able to detect it, to do something about it, reach out to someone, and that's how change can happen. Because when you have increased prices, sure, everyone is affected. An increase in $1 for the price of bread or gas or milk or poultry or baby formula, or access to cell phone markets. All these increases in prices, everyone feels it, but really the people who feel the pinch are the most vulnerable of us, the ones who count, how much they can spend on bread or milk. It's not the people who, every day will spend an extra few dollars for a gourmet coffee. So it's important to remember that these are the people that are impacted. These are the people whose purchasing behaviors change as a result of these increases in prices. And often they don't even know why they're paying more. And when you don't know, like I said, you're powerless to stop it.
And the news, in my opinion, does not do a good job at all of explaining why the average person is being affected by inflation. It's usually political talking points from our media, rather than a real, dive into what is really happening and what we could do to improve it. But the thing is, does it go deeper than just paying for price? Are there other harms uniquely to minorities and vulnerable communities from these activities and these situations?
Absolutely. And I'll just, touch on your comment about not being informed, and that's absolutely true. It's so politicized that, if people on both sides of the aisle can just step back and really look at what's causing these increases in prices and the problems in our markets and the consolidation, it's something I think everyone could come together on. But when you say, it's the other side that's doing it, it's very difficult, and it confuses people, and it confuses the consumers of those news who are being impacted the most. Going back to your question, so the first impact I talked about was price, but it does go deeper than that, right? Because we're not just talking about higher prices for consumers. Anti-competitive activity can squeeze out competing businesses, entrants into the market, nascent competitors. And again, bad for everybody. But, let's use a real world experience to think about who is really being affected here, who is typically entrenched, and who is typically on the outside. And, the answer is obvious. It is vulnerable communities, disadvantaged communities, minority business owners who are historically, because of historical constructs whose impact still persists today. And this is something we talk about, in the news across all disciplines, about how historical constructs continue to impact who has power and who doesn't. And So when you're talking about those without power trying to break into markets to be able to sell their goods and their services, and often it's goods and services that are there to fill a need or demand in these the vulnerable communities or minority communities. Think of your halal store. But if there is entrenchment and those people can't break through, those firms can't break through into the market, then they're the ones that are being disproportionately pushed out. They're the ones that don't have access to the American dream. The incumbents are fine. What they want to do is just perpetuate that status quo. And that is why antitrust exists, to be able to discipline that and ensure that there is a robust competition. Because if those minority-owned businesses can't break through and they can't provide services to their communities, then the entire community suffers. The entire community is left without access, without representation in the marketplace.
Well,
So it's not just price, it goes deeper.
If a baby formula goes up, let's say 10 cents or 25 cents, that's still a percentage over a month of someone's income that may not have a lot of income. So it's a much higher percentage than someone that says, I don't care if this coffee went up $1, I'm still going to get what I want, because it's not even registering as any percentage of their income. So, that's really interesting. And one thing I learned recently was that there are only 3 formula companies in the United States, and they're heavily, heavily regulated. And it sounds to me like maybe they helped write those rules so that other people couldn't break into that market. And that feels like why we had a shortage. One, there's something to that. And also there's no competition. There's 3, but it doesn't make sense. So, tell me what you think about that, and, who's impacted and what they can do about it. Most people don't think they can do anything about it.
That's right. And you brought up 2 good points. One is the consolidation and what happens to our supply of necessities if there's consolidation and something happens to that supply chain. And you saw it. We're reaching out to Germany to send emergency baby formula to mothers because there was a disruption in the supply chain, and there are no alternatives. And it's not just baby formula. You'll notice very similar patterns in, for example, poultry or pork or beef. And you have just a few dominant companies who control those markets. And when there is a disruption in the supply chain, as happened during COVID, one plant is affected, and then all of a sudden the nation's food supply is at risk. And it's if that's not a wake-up call to people, it should be. So I absolutely agree. And the second point that you brought up, just before I forget it, was that it's the 10, 25 cents increase might not be felt by rich people. And that's specifically why it is very important for the most vulnerable of us and for everyone, the common man, to understand how they are impacted disproportionately by anti-competitive activity. You can't rely on rich people to discipline those markets because they might not feel it. They don't care. And if you don't know,
the big deal.
Right, exactly. And you care, but if you don't know that it's anti-competitive activity that's causing, these phenomena in the marketplaces, then you can't do anything about it. And the firm gets away with it, and corporate profits go up, which everyone complains about. But again, no one knows where to point the finger.
Well, in a future episode, we'll have to point the finger. But real quick before we end, I'd really like to know, you mentioned inflation at the beginning, and I wanted to come back to that so you could expound upon your comments.
I did. And truthfully, the relationship between inflation and anti-competitive behavior deserves kind of its own full episode, its own full rich discussion. But the reason I mentioned it, and I'll talk about it briefly, is because this is something that is felt very much, very directly by families today. It's all over the news. To most people, it's almost as if, their money just magically became less valuable in terms of purchasing power. They can just do less with it. And again, we don't know where to point the finger. The news example, it's great. It points the finger at the other side. But that's not really accurate. Consolidation, market dominance, market power, these are things that can drive inflation because you have excess corporate profits. There's a very good data on this, I think, from the Economic Policy Institute, as well as from the Fed, I believe. But that's the reality. Corporate profits are one of the largest driving forces of inflation.
How dare you? How dare you?
Right. And not only can consolidation, lead to inflation and higher prices, but the causation works the other way too. In moments of inflation, dominant firms are much better able to take advantage of that environment and raise their prices even more, where a smaller competitor cannot do that. Of course, they're opportunistic. They do that, especially if it's a business that charges fees to other businesses, for example, to smaller businesses. And this is common in platforms and networks. They're able to raise those fees. And if those fees are variable, meaning it's based on, the overall price, then it's a double whammy. They gain every time prices go up. When inflation happens, they gain automatically, and they have the opportunity to increase prices kind of artificially. And it's, like I said, we could talk about this for a while, but inflation is something that angers people. It's felt by people. And if enough people knew what was driving this, I think there would be a lot more demand and calls for action for serious antitrust scrutiny instead of pointing the fingers politically, as the day might have it.
Well, there's very clear examples of how the shipping industry is worldwide is consolidated down to just a couple of real people that own all the other lines, and their profits have gone up 400% or more. I mean, it's unbelievable how much the profits have gone up, and their costs haven't gone up. So it's basically them just forcing the price up. And the same is true in other industries where you can clearly see that their costs have not gone up much, but their prices have, and their corporate profits have gone up commensurately. So we see this. So thank you for volunteering to come back and talk about inflation. And it's funny that this is an antitrust conversation, but so much of it is about inflation, because that is the real impact of these anti-competitive markets that we have right now. One of our beliefs, at least my personal belief, is that we don't have capitalism right now because it's been the laws that are supposed to strengthen capitalism and the moving of capital and competition are really watered down so much now that we don't really practice as much antitrust as we should. And that's why we're so happy to have you come and talk about that. So do you have any final comments?
So I'll say, thank you for having me back. I am, that guy who lives in that dark corner of the library. So I'm happy always to talk about antitrust and in the context of inflation or otherwise. And so anytime. And I do also appreciate the work that the FSIC is doing, actually being one of the few organizations that is shining a light onto antitrust in the context of the impacts and how we can protect vulnerable communities, minority communities, and the disadvantaged, because nobody else is doing it. So thank you. And I think, as far as a parting thought is concerned, It's simple. It's important to know who's pinching your pocket. It's important to know if you're not succeeding, even though you think you are innovating and should have a chance to compete, but something is fishy and it's just not happening. You need to know why. And often anti-competitive behavior is to blame. And you need to know what the tools are to protect yourself. And that's antitrust. And if you know that, and your neighbor knows that, and your community knows that, you can actually have a grassroots response that can help our markets and help the communities.
Well, you'll hear this from us at FSIC more and more and more, is that the communities that are the worst impacted don't know how to advocate for themselves. So we're having an actually minority policy summit soon to discuss how in technology and healthcare and education, the communities that are most affected, we can try to show them how to advocate for themselves and why it's bad and what to do. Because if you don't know, how to build something, then you're not going to be able to do it. If somebody shows you how, then you can do it. So we want these communities to, gain more opportunity by advocating for themselves and having a voice. So, well, Chris, I just can't thank you enough. You really are a great person to have on the show. I'm sure we'll have you again. And I would also like to thank all of the other FSIC network members for their efforts to promote economic empowerment and social justice. Thanks for listening today. And if you need more information, come see us at fsicoalition.org. Thank you.